It's great to welcome to the program today Geoffrey Cain, Senior Fellow in Critical Emerging Technologies at the Lincoln Policy Network, and also author of the book The Perfect Police State, an undercover odyssey into China's terrifying surveillance dystopia of the future, a book I recently read. Great to have you on today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, David.
So, for people who maybe have not studied this topic or have only a kind of passing or a rudimentary understanding of what has been going on in China, in particular with the Uyghur population, maybe we can back up a little and ask the question: what have relations been between the Chinese Communist Party and the Uyghur population, particularly in Xinjiang, historically in China?
Yes, so Xinjiang is a region of China that's about twice the size of Texas, and it's on, you could say, the western frontier of what is today China. But historically, it was home to a group of people called the Uyghurs, who are mostly Muslim, and they populated this region for hundreds, almost 1,000 years. This is really their homeland. I think a good comparison would be to imagine the European settlers in America and the Native Americans, and that's sort of how China looks at this region. It's a place that it's been expanding westward into, and it keeps running into this Uyghur population and these other ethnic minority groups who practice a different religion, have a distinct language, distinct culture. There are about 12 million people there. Sparsely populated area. It's oasis and desert and mountains, and it truly is the place that China has been trying to build and develop with oil and railroads, and turning it into this frontier land where Chinese settlers can go and they can find their riches and opportunity.
So, in terms of the motivations for the treatment of the Uyghur population to be what it is, there are perspectives that say this is mostly xenophobic lines based on Muslim religion. There are other perspectives that say there's a sort of business oriented perspective, as you're talking about, and desires to turn that area into something that is much more financially viable. What is the origin of the circumstances as we now see them?
So there's a lot of origins to this situation in Xinjiang. There are currently about 1.8 million people in concentration camps in this region, which is about 1/10 of the minority population. So, imagine the North American equivalent. It's as if, a minority, blacks or Native Americans or whoever it might be, 1/10 of them being taken away without being charged with a crime to a concentration camp. The reasons for this, many reasons. But it mostly goes back to, you could say, a war on terror just taken to an extreme. The U.S. was waging the war on terror for many years. It's calmed down now, but China seized on that war on terror and took it to its authoritarian system over these people. Uh, that the United States, that they're infected with terrorist ideas, that they need to be purged. And so they created this total surveillance dystopia using artificial intelligence and overhanded policing and facial recognition cameras everywhere to try to get inside the thoughts of every single Uyghur, to predict their behavior and to try to turn them into good patriots of the state.
Okay, so you mentioned the facial recognition. In the book, you talk about a lot of the different sort of elements of the surveillance state that are in place there. Kind of a two-part question. Can you talk about some of the other surveillance methods that are used? And also, are these only in place in this region, or are these also to some degree in other parts of China as well?
So when I was writing the book, it was starting in Xinjiang. These measures were being rolled out in the region, and they were experimental about 4 years when I started writing the book. Since I've published it, these methods, these tactics, and technologies have expanded throughout many parts of China. So Tibet, great example. Inner Mongolia. There are all these regions of China that are home to minorities who are being repressed violently. So to give you an idea of other tactics, just imagine an old sci-fi novel or a movie. I think that this is most like the movie Minority Report with Tom Cruise, about a police force that tries to engage in predictive policing. They can try to predict a murder and then arrest the person and brainwash them. They brainwash them in this system before the murder can happen. That's what's happening in Xinjiang, and will pull different data points, and the data points could be things like, whether a person leaves the home to the front door at 9 a.m. every day to go to work, whether they go grocery shopping, every other day at 6 p.m. What do they buy? There are cameras watching them. What do they read? In the case of my book, I found one young woman reading too many books. And there is there are these camera systems everywhere that are watching you and gathering this data and then trying to predict, are you going to be a threat to the state in the future? Are you going to try and commit some kind of terrorist, rebellious act against the Communist Party? And so they take you to a concentration camp, psychologically, physically torture you, and try to get you to resent your supposed evil ways and to become this shell of your former self where you simply accept and internalize the demands of the Communist Party.
Now, in the book, you describe kind of two different layers. There's the re-education camps and what are sometimes called the concentration camps. And the concentration camps are worse than the re-education camps. It seems that typically there's more of an exit path from the re-education camps if you sort of comply and are, doing what you're asked. Can you talk about the relationship between these two kind of levels that exists there?
Certainly. So there are more levels now. The system has expanded since I wrote the book. So the lowest level is just, they call it a re-education center. The formal name is Re-Education and Training Center, and this is a place where you'll be summoned there as a Uyghur person to undergo, patriotic lessons, to study law and civics and all that sort of thing. And then after you might go for like 2 years for a class, and you can go home every day, maybe at 6 p.m. to see your family, or maybe go home for the weekends, but you have to stay there a certain amount of time. That's one of the lower levels. If you're deemed a more serious threat, then you're kicked up to what is called a detention center. And a detention center is just a euphemism for a fully loaded concentration camp. That's where they have the guard dogs and the SWAT teams and the guard posts and snipers up there watching everyone. These places are truly terrifying. I haven't been able to personally visit one, and obviously it wouldn't be something you can just drop in and report on, gather information on. But I was able to gather. I interviewed more than 100 Uyghurs who had been through these camps, who had managed to get out, through various means. And just the stories they told were absolutely terrifying. I mean, this is something different altogether from the atrocities that we saw in the 20th century. The 20th century was the age of genocide. It was the age of the big camps where they had mass graves, of Auschwitz, of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. The mass killings of men, women, and children. That was truly a terrifying time to be alive in a lot of places. When it comes to Xinjiang and China in the 21st century, in the year 2022 now, we're seeing the evolution of new forms of mass surveillance and mass atrocities. The Chinese nation, the government, has perfected ways of controlling people, of finding ways to control their identity, to try to brainwash them into being someone else without actually outright, killing them. They don't pull out a gun and shoot you and put you in a mass grave. They don't have a gas chamber. They manage to erase your identity, erase your culture, and to essentially commit genocide through the use of overhanded technology.
So there is a movement that, oh man, it's like hard to even know how to do this justice in bringing it up. There are some who are increasingly denying to different degrees that this is even taking place. Now, there are some who say it's not a genocide. They don't necessarily deny some elements of what you're saying, but you're saying people aren't really being wholesale killed. That part's not going on, although what's going on isn't good. There's others who are making claims like the messengers, presumably some of the people you spoke to, are people who are making up these stories to either attack the Chinese Communist Party because they are anti-communist or whatever. I don't want to too narrowly characterize where this comes from, but in the US, it does seem to be folks who, generally speaking, are more sympathetic to not only the Chinese Communist Party, but to the politics of the Hugo Chavez Maduro type regimes in Venezuela. It's that there seems to be sort of like being in league there. I can't adjudicate every single claim, but can you talk a little bit about the origins of this and whether there's any aspect of it that we should be paying attention to specifically?
Yeah, so we know without any doubt whatsoever by now that these atrocities are happening, that the camps exist. We have full documentation, we have satellite imagery, we have thousands upon thousands of testimony from refugees, many of which line up. In my case, I interviewed 168 people, including not just refugees, but people who were inside the system, who actually worked for the Chinese technology companies building these systems. I mean, we went through Chinese corporate records, even Chinese companies that build these systems. They like to brag. They're proud of what they do. They don't see it as something shameful or worth hiding. They've admitted to it openly in the Chinese language. If you can read Mandarin, you can find corporate reports that talk about what they're doing in Xinjiang. There isn't, there are no secrets anymore to what's going on. And it's really unfortunate that, in the States in particular, or just in the Western world, there are people, they tend to be more on the left, on the hard left, who, they think that you have to choose. The reasoning goes that you have to choose one or the other. If you side with the United States of America, then you are an imperialist, colonialist bastard who's just trying to oppress China, trying to oppress, global non-aligned, people of color movements. That's sort of how they frame it. So therefore, the idea you should be sympathetic to China and see these, these accusations of genocide, these camps, therefore, they must be made up by this, this American imperialist system. These evil conservatives are just making up stuff to smear China, to justify a war against China. It's just, it's outright denialism, and it's really unfortunate that some of these leftists, these hard leftists and socialists, who claim to uphold progressive values, at home they talk about social justice, and then when it comes to minorities overseas in other countries, they're on the side of an authoritarian regime. So the term tanky, and it just so I don't know if you've heard that term tanky, but these are the
I've said before, because it has such a pejorative connotation, I tend to call it the revolutionary left. And this is as someone on the left who considers myself a progressive. I've chosen that term, but certainly tanky is a term I'm familiar with.
Yeah, yeah. And I would consider myself kind of a progressive centrist. I support human rights around the world. There are also people on the other side too, on the right, who just have these crazy, crazy views about the Chinese global conspiracy taking over the world. So it's unfortunate that this particular topic gets polarized when there are major human rights atrocities happening.
What about more specific? So that gives us a great kind of general orientation. What about the more narrow claim that a lot of what is being described is absolutely happening? You can't deny the surveillance, the satellite surveillance, all that, but that there is not genocide taking place.
So the genocide question is a separate question, and that falls under the international law of genocide. So here's the thing about the genocide question. The One of the major problems that needs to be one of the things that needs to be established is the intent to commit genocide. Chinese officials defend themselves by arguing that they are not committing genocide. They are simply developing the region. They claim that they're trying to lessen birth rates. They don't want, they want family planning. And when they defend themselves that way, that places these projects in a different kind of framework, and that's what makes it more difficult to prove that this is actually a genocide. Now, under international law, the one major factor that would make this a genocide, that numerous academics and scholars have documented well, is the forced sterilization of women, the forced sterilization in an attempt to erase an entire people, to erase the next generation. And that is really, I think that if there's going to be that one, kind of that one turning point within international law, that one thing, that's going to be the thing that will define this as genocide in the future.
The book is The Perfect Police State. We've been speaking with the author, Geoffrey Cain. I so appreciate your time today, and really recommend the book to anybody who's interested in this topic or isn't yet interested, but really should be. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, David.